the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. And guess what? Second a night, we have a show for the second day in a row. I jumped on for a solo pod, recording Saturday night, talking about kind of the coaching situation, and Seth and I are recording on a Sunday night. We have some more coaching stuff, but that's not what the basis of this show is initially to be, because we have had two all-star games for the draft coming up, and so we've got bonus shows. We've got a show tonight. We're recording with Justin Higdon on Tuesday, but this is episode 396. We're going to talk about the finalists for the Cardinals coaching job, and then we're going to focus on the East-West Shrine Bowl. Who stood out in that game? A game that I will admit I had it on. It was not a great game, in my opinion. The non-touchdown game, but
yeah,
that's beside the point. Let's get Seth Cox from RevengeBirds.com is here, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site, and he's also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast. Perfect time right now to get on that show if you haven't started, to get all that draft information that you can catch old episodes, and if you want to jump on and add to at least the $2 a month tier, where you get their bonus shows each week and get load up on draft information. They've been on it all the entire college football season, and even more now in the offseason to get ready for the draft. I'm Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site for the Arizona Cardinals. And apparently, after we had three new candidates last week, we had second interviews. So as of Saturday, before I got on and recorded a quick show when I was visiting my son in Lubbock, it was a kind of a throwback to the original podcast days when I would record from my closet. I now have an office where I sit, but I was in my son's bathroom in his apartment recording that one because I didn't have all my equipment. I didn't have my regular microphone, but talked about kind of the three guys getting second interviews, which were Lou Anarumo, Mike Kafka, and Aaron Glenn. A report has come out since then that the Cardinals are down to three finalists. Aaron Glenn is not in that mix. Brian Flores is getting a second interview this week, and the finalists are Anarumo, Kafka, and Brian Flores. Let's break down kind of the things right now, Seth. Is it surprising to you that Flores is finally getting that second interview when feels like it's been a year since he was connected? He's always been connected because of the Monty Ossenfort thing, but the fact that it didn't bring him in for that second interview has felt odd, and he's been interviewing for defensive coordinator positions as well.
Yeah, it was odd that it kind of took this long, but at the same time, it was expected, wasn't it? That kind of like you said, like we never heard that he was no longer a candidate and that they were just starting. And so when they start, I think the strangest thing was when they announced the initial, and by announce we're using that incredibly liberally because they don't announce anything, but when it came out about the second round of interviews for a couple of people, initially it was just Anarumo and
Kafka.
Kafka.
And we got the Aaron Glenn information previously from Josina Anderson, although Aaron Glenn sort of disappeared after that.
And so we waited patiently for about an hour or two, and then I think it was Rappaport or Pelissaro came out and said, "Oh, by the way, Brian Flores is also getting a second interview with the Arizona Cardinals." So it makes you think that their initial interviews with Anarumo, Kafka, and
Brian Callahan priorly did not impress.
Yeah, Callahan. And then we do have the question because, like you said, Josina Anderson, very good reporter, very reliable reporter. She is the one that reported that Aaron Glenn was getting a second interview. We do not know. Jess and I have not been able to confirm whether or not that actually took place. And so that makes you wonder one of two things. Either one, um, he interviewed and didn't impress the second time, maybe similar to Dan Quinn, and they just are letting them know, hey, not our guy this year, this go around. We appreciate you guys interviewing, right?
Yes, and that
Or
included in this report as well is now that Vance Joseph is officially out as
as a head
in the running
coach.
for head coach. However, he has not been let out of his contract as coordinator. So, as I talked about, and I posted on Twitter today when I proposed the question: is everyone prepared for the potential pairing of Mike Kafka as head coach and Vance Joseph as defensive coordinator? Talked about on that on episode 395. It's kind of a redo of the Cliff Kingsbury. It makes a lot of sense, but I know it doesn't move the bit. The fact that he is still under contract and not being allowed to seek other possibilities when we know that there's interest around the league for Vance Joseph's services as a defensive coordinator suggests that the Cardinals are heavily, or at least strongly considering him. They want him back in 2023.
Yeah, it feels like that. And it does feel like when you look at it that, and it makes you wonder about maybe Quinn and Glenn. And again, this is Jess and I just speculating, talking, whether they were like, no, he wouldn't be on our staff. And that potentially led to, okay, you're not going to get the job. We're not saying it is or isn't, but it makes you wonder. Because, with those three, and you and I talked about this off the air, with Flores and Honoramo, it's not as big of a deal concern if Vance is the DC, because they're still going to have their fingerprints on the defense as the head coach, right? Like they're the guys that the buck's going to stop with them one way or the other.
I think that there is some interesting connections there. It's important to note that Anarumo was back when Joseph, for the one season he was defensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins, Anarumo was part of his staff. So the of the three finalists, you've got Kafka, you've got Anarumo, and you've got Brian Flores. Because of Kafka's lack of defensive connections, it would make a lot of sense to keep Joseph on at least for this first year. Anarumo, it kind of makes sense because they've worked together. Brian Flores is the one where you're like, while they both coached the Dolphins, they were not at the same time. And so that would be the one that would be the intriguing connection, and because it doesn't make a perfect fit. We know that Vance Joseph also is flexible enough to coach multiple schemes and fronts. He kept a 4-3 in Miami in that 2016 year because of the personnel they had. Now, he ran a 3-4 with Denver. He was run a 3-4 here, but this last season was very 4-3 looking. So Vance Joseph is flexible enough and very he's able to do multiple fronts is what we've seen. But I don't know, with Flores in the mix, you feel like he probably is the favorite because of the Austin Fort connection. Anarumo is interesting because, as we were trying to talk about before the show, he doesn't have a wealth of he's been a coordinator. He's not a longtime coordinator, and he's only got he's got 30 years of coaching experience. Only the last decade has been the NFL, and most of that was as a defensive backs coach. And most of it was with one team, as we talked about. So it was 2012 to 2018, 2012 to 2017 was all with Miami. And so it's hard to kind of find a coaching comp for the type of promotion that would be. Mike Kafka is like all of the offensive coordinator promotions that we've seen over the last several years. Brian Flores is your classic, failed as a head coach once, he's getting another shot. And Arumo, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and it's one, like you said, we're trying to figure it out. I'm like, who's we talked about Aaron Glenn and kind of the Mike Vrabel situation and how that would be akin to something that we've seen. It's really interesting with Anarumo because, as you said, his background is not nearly as vast, and it's tough because you go to, like, let's say Dan Quinn, right? So Quinn was at William and Mary, and then Hofstra for about 7 years at the spots, and then he at 31 broke into the NFL. Um, and he was in the NFL at 31 with the 49ers, and like you said, 49ers, Dolphins, Jets, Seahawks, back to college, back to the Seahawks as the DC, and then at 45 got his head coaching chance. That's not Lou. And so, like, where do you how many and people want to say Bruce Arians, but Bruce was in the league for
He was in the pros
ever.
forever, and he'd been an offensive coordinator for a long time.
And so it's not a bad thing. It's not like we're saying like it can't work. What we're saying is, like, it's a very unique situation that he's getting this opportunity, and something that we just haven't really seen. A guy that, like you said, I mean, a college coach for 22 years, mostly defensive backs, and then his time in Miami and New York before he finally got a DC chance at 53. I mean, 53, his first DC gig. Like, it's just a very slow burn. And so there's one of two ways to look at it. One being that, he would come in and understand that this is probably his one and only shot, right? To be a head coach in
Yeah.
the league. Like, he's not going to get a second chance. Um, and two, he's probably going to be a guy that, is, like we said, his connections aren't as vast. He's not going to have the pull of a Brian Flores, who's, what, 15 years younger, 10 years younger, but has been in the NFL for almost, or a little over 20 years. Um, coaching, and whether, or I guess technically 19 years, but been in the NFL. Now it's mostly with just New England and Miami, right? So his experience, maybe network isn't as vast, but that New England network we know it's tough to beat in terms of, like, who they've worked with or who's come through things. So it'll be interesting, yeah, because Flores is only 41. I mean, that's a young guy. Anaramu 56 isn't old by any stretch of the imagination for a head coach, but a first time head coach, a guy that has never done it before. I guess the closest thing you can say for Anaramu would honestly be Mike Tomlin just 20 years later.
Yeah.
Like, that's and again, I can't overstate how much it's odd to see a guy that's been coaching for as long as Anaramu have that little of NFL experience at his age. Because, like, uh, Tomlin was 29 when he got his break with the Buccaneers as their DB coach, and then he was 34 when he got his DC job, and then 35 when he became a head coach. So, like, again, we're talking 20 years different, but the experience, 7 years as a DC coach in the NFL is probably the most that we can akin it to, but it's still tough, man, to, like, find anybody that would have that. And we talked about Kafka too, right? That would be a really odd one, but it would be more in lines with, like, the Tomlins and those guys that get breakthrough so young, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Oh,
know,
and it's completely the trend in the NFL right now.
it is. It's taking shots on off, because, as we've talked about, remember, this is something that we talked about with Honoramu that's a concern, is who is his offensive coordinator going to be. And it's not just who his offensive coordinator who it would be who is his offensive coordinator the next season. And the next season after that. Because I can tell you this, right? If Anaramu gets the job and brings in, the QB coach in Cincy, I don't even know who it is. I'm just throwing a person out there, and Kyler throws for 32 touchdowns and only 10 interceptions, and runs for 6 or something at the end of the year. Guess what? Guess who's going to be a head coaching candidate the next year?
Yeah, totally.
And that's just how it goes. So you look at it, it'll be really interesting, man. I'm genuinely interested to see how this goes, because I don't mind any of the candidates, and I think you feel the same. Like, I have my favorites, but I don't dislike any of the candidates.
Absolutely.
It's just going to be a matter of who they bring in and how they make it work.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web, we're going to move forward, talk about the Shrine Bowl. We're going to start with the offensive side of the ball. Who were the players who stood out? This is going to be more of the Seth show. I watched the game, but this is his part. So that's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. The Shrine game, the East-West Shrine Bowl, not the Shrine game, but the Shrine Bowl, was on Thursday in Las Vegas, as part of the kind of like the preview or the beginning of the Pro Bowl games festivities and all that. And it was not a good game. That's being said, they're a player that it's not just the game, it's also the practice, is how they look. But we're kind of in these final 2 segments of this show, Seth will talk about kind of the offensive players who stood out, and then the defensive players who stood out. Obviously, when you have a game with no touchdowns and one of the MVPs, kicker who hit 4 field goals, tells you.
By the way, a guy worth drafting for the Arizona
Jake
Cardinals.
Moody is worth a draft pick.
Yeah, he 100% is worth. I mean, you're talking about a 5-year kicker that has missed 8 field goals, and 6 of them are from over 50 yards.
Hey.
He's a guy, and think about that. That's at Michigan. So what indoor stadiums is he playing in all the time?
They're in the big, not many. The Big Ten is windy and cold. So let's start with the offensive side of the ball, Seth. I will put in my plug for the one guy that caught my eye, but of course he was going to catch my eye. That's Valade, running back from Arizona State. I watched his 1 year with the Sun Devils was fantastic. He's super productive. There's not, like, in terms of traits, it doesn't feel like he does anything particularly special, and I'm super intrigued to find out what his athletic testing is. But the number of running backs that we've seen come out of Arizona State, and last year seeing Rashad White come out and make an impact as a rookie. The other guys who've come out, Benjamin had nice games. DJ Foster had a nice niche in his career. Marion Grice didn't do anything. It's been a while.
But Grice was a guy too that a lot of people like. So to your point, like, he didn't live up to expectations, but he was looked at as a guy that could potentially. And then there was a guy after him who I cannot remember for the life of me.
Kalen Ballage.
From Ballage, that's
and
the one.
He's just kind of stuck around
he's a guy
back of the roster back.
Yeah, but he was a 4th-round pick.
Yeah,
a lot of people thought, because he's big, right? 6'2", 230,
and athletic.
People were like,
though I said, watching him his last year at Arizona State, I'm like, he's never going to be anything because he just trips and falls.
Yeah, he's a guy. I remember a lot of people wanted him to be the next David Johnson.
Yes,
because similar size, athleticism.
Well, he had that Texas Tech, the 6 touchdown game against Texas Tech when Patrick Mahomes came to town. That game was fun. That game was fun.
And he could catch the heck out of the ball. So, like, he was a 2-way back. So, yeah, to your point, ASU, you look at it, what they've done at ASU, and we'll try not to make this an ASU heavy show, but what they've done at ASU the last decade is produce skill players, specifically running backs and wide receivers, that are fantastic in terms of NFL production. And what people don't understand is that you don't have to produce all pros, but if you're producing consistent NFL contributors, and Balaj, to Jess's point, bounced around the league. I mean, he's been on 4 teams. He wasn't on a roster this year, so again, but 4 teams in 4 seasons. That's making it in the NFL. I know people will be like, not really, no, but that is. I mean, 4 teams, 4 seasons to play in 52 NFL games. That's a lot of
Yeah.
that's a dream come true.
But Valade, he was he was the workhorse in that game. He was consistently solid. He got positive yards, and that's kind of what he did at Arizona State. He scored a lot of touchdowns. He has some length. I want to know how athletic it is, but I felt he was one of the players that stood out. But I look at the history of Arizona State backs, and I think, is he better than is he better than what Rachaad White was? Is he better than what Benjamin was? I think he was, especially with Rachaad White this last year coming out, getting drafted by the Buccaneers and being an impactful player as a rookie. I have hopes that Valade can do that in the pros.
Yeah, I think that's a valid, expectation for him. He's a guy that, like you said, he's one of those guys. He weighed in where he was supposed to, 5'11", 200 pounds. I mean, they list him at 199, 200 pounds. Like, he hit what he was supposed to hit in that. And then you saw him, like, 88 career catches. Like you said, he didn't really get to catch the ball, but that's because outside of one quarterback, there was nobody really good this weekend at the Shrine Bowl, or this week at the Shrine Bowl, I guess. But he did have, 76 yards on 13 carries. It's a nice day. I think he's draftable, and I think that's, again, a big thing if you're an ASU fan, just to see that continue, right? From there, it's you're looking at 2 different things. You're looking at, like you said, who stood out in the game, and then who stood out during the week. And so let's start with during the week. And the first guy that stood out, maybe the guy that showed the most, maybe the guy that's going to get drafted first at the Shrine out of the Shrine Bowl, is Zay Flowers, the wide receiver out of Boston College, getting a lot of T.Y. Hilton comparisons, size wise. We will see speed wise. That's, Jess kind of hit it on the head. This is the problem when you're watching these things, is that even though it is a quote unquote all-star game, you're getting a lot of guys that are going up against lesser competition. So a guy in Flowers is looked at by a lot of the draft community as somebody that's going to be a late day 1, early day 2 pick. And he's going up against guys that Justin and I talked about on the podcast, if you had a chance to listen to the Shrine Bowl podcast, that are good college prospects, but we were talking about them as like late day 3 undrafted people to know. So, that's always the one thing that you want to preface this. I do also have to put out the caveat, if you have not listened to the original Draft Breakdown podcast, Justin and I, so when we talk about this, we are actually friends with a lot of the people that run and do the scouting for the Shrine game. And so I just want that out there so people understand that, like, yes, I do have an actual, like, personal relationship with a lot of these guys that put a lot of time and effort into finding these guys. But Zay Flowers was a different cat, man. 5'10", 100, and I can't remember exactly what they list him at, but he's a lean dude. And that's going to be the question for him, is, can he hold up in the league? We've seen that these wide receivers are getting small, though, right? We talked about Devontae Smith a couple of years ago. Jordan Addison's probably going to be the first wide receiver off the board in this draft class, and he's going to be another slight fellow. So it's not as big as it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago when you had a bevy of bigger guys, but it is still something that you look at. The other guy that I wanted to mention as a wide receiver that had a great week, and is a guy that I know it's a new offense, so when I say this, I'm acknowledging it, but that could be the guy that replaces AJ Green is A.T. Perry, Atorian Perry out of Wake Forest, 6'3", about 195 pounds. They use him a lot like the Bengals used T. Higgins, what the Cardinals wanted to see out of AJ Green, right? Like a big jump ball guy, a guy that's just taller than everybody else. He's a guy that really stood out this week, that showed that he could be a guy that wins consistently on the outside, again using that size and length. So he's a guy that, when you look at it, he was a guy that made a lot of noise all week. Like you said, the game was quiet itself. The reason the game was quiet is because you had one quarterback that was really worth talking about. And, you know, as Arizona Cardinals fans, we have to start to be realistic about what may come of the future. And so one of those things is having a younger, capable backup quarterback. We've seen what that does, like for the Baltimore Ravens, like, right? Like Tyler Huntley has won them games. Obviously, you don't want to go as far as saying like, oh, the next Brock Purdy, because who knows what Brock Purdy ends up being, but you're also not going to expect your backup quarterback to get you to the NFC Championship game, right? So, but Dorian Thompson Robinson, a lean guy, 6'1", 191. Jess or Justin and I actually joked about it on our podcast because I said, and I quote, I think he's going to come in lighter than he's listed at. And I think he's going to be shorter or taller than they list him because they're trying to compact him and make him look
It's going to make
a
him
little bigger.
in the combine. He's going to come across 6'2", 185.
Yeah, and so he's a well, no, UCLA listed him at 6 foot 205, and he came in at 6'1" and 190. So like he is he's just a beanpole. I mean, ASU fans remember Jaden Daniels, Dorian Thompson Robinson's built the same way, but you know what? He looked really good. He looked really comfortable out of the Chip Kelly spread offense and just running, a general offense at the Shrine. Good athlete. He's not a runner first, but he's a guy that can move. And so just a guy to kind of keep in the back of your mind. He's a day 3 guy with his arm strength and again, that size is going to be concerning because that's, sub 200 pounds is tough. And then all of a sudden you're talking about 190. Like it's a lean guy. Offensive lineman, man, they had a couple that had a really good week. Offensive line and corner are the two hardest positions to play in these camps. And the reason why is because one-on-ones typically go towards the attacking player. So on offense, obviously the receiver running the route, and then on defense, the defensive lineman, right? So a lot of the times what happens is you get guys that have good sets and good reps during the week, and then you kind of just lose them during the game because let's be honest, it's really tough to watch 5 offensive linemen over and over and over again. But 2 guys that really stood out were the Baylor offensive tackle Connor Galvin. Baylor's been a really interesting program over the last couple of years. They had the huge issue reset, and then all of a sudden, under Dave Aranda, they've kind of come back. Galvin's an interesting prospect because he reminds me of and the name's Cole Toner. Remember Cole Toner a couple years ago?
Absolutely.
Out of Harvard, 6'6", 293. So like a guy that you're like, oh, we could just get 15, 20 pounds on him. Well, I've learned that that's not, and part of it's talking to people to learn these things, but like part of it is just simply like learning these things. It's really not as easy as we all think to put on 15 pounds and still be an elite athlete. So that'll be Galvin's biggest thing as he gets to the pros, but he had a really solid week. He's going to get drafted. The other guy is Antonio Maffei. Again, another UCLA player. I thought the UCLA guys really did a nice job this week. They kind of stood out. they showed what Chip's building down there. Kind of the opposite though of Galvin when we talk about size. 6'2", 338 pounds. So two different body builds, two different, size guys. And Mafi is going to play on the interior. He is a polar bear. He's got almost 33-inch arms, which is the threshold for most, tackles, but he has 10 and 3/8-inch hands. So like once he gets his paws on you, and I'm saying that literally, like it's game over. This dude is like we're talking 6'2" and 340 pounds. He's a monster. And that was the thing he had to do this week. He had to show that he could move well, because when you're that big, it's really difficult to gauge athleticism. And so a guy that did that this week was Mafi. I thought he did a great job. The last guy I want to mention on the offensive side is, I've already mentioned, the kicker Jake Moody. He won the MVP of the Shrine Bowl. Just alluded to that, which tells you the offense wasn't great, which is why you don't have a ton of offensive guys to talk about out of this. But you saw a guy that is one, like I said, a 5-year kicker in the Big Ten, has kicked in Big Ten championship games, national championship semifinal games, and been nails. Huge deal, right? And incredibly important. Moody is also a guy that kicked all the points for the West team, and had two 51-yard field goals that they measured. You remember now they do this thing where they say would have been good from from over 60 yards, both of them. So he is a guy that you're talking about, and this is always the problem. Like when you talk about kickers, immediately it goes to Iguano, who the Bucks took in the second round, right?
Sebastian Janikowski in the first round.
But at least he held around forever, right? The kid out of ASU that was here for a little bit, that Zane Gonzalez. Yeah, those guys all set a bad precedent. So now you don't. Moody's a guy, like, if he, with that compensatory pick in the 6th round, if he's there, you grab him. I think he's going to go in the 4th round. That's how good he is. Like, and we've seen for the Cardinals the last couple of years how important it is, right, to see this, to have guys that can make field goals in clutch situations. You mentioned Valladay. He played fantastic. There's a couple other guys that we can mention. The Jordan Mims and Tavian Thomas, the other running backs, had, they looked like they could play a little bit. And then Joseph Nada out of Clemson, another big guy that potentially could be a guy that you get like on day 3. Never lived up to the hype. I think he was like the number 1 wide receiver recruit coming out. And just never lived up to the hype, but like he's a guy that didn't have a bad week.
It's coming next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's wrap this up. Seth will give us his top performers, top guys to know from the Shrine Bowl on the defensive side of the ball. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise of See Red podcast, best of our Cardinals talk on the web. Defensive prospects from the Shrine Bowl. Seth was about to get started, so wanted to make sure we could get a break in there. Take it away.
Yeah, the defensive side, it was a good week for a lot of guys, man. Like there was a lot of guys that impressed, that played well. And it's tough because, again, the Shrine, or not the Shrine, but just these bowls in general are difficult. I wrote about one guy on Revenge of the Birds, BJ Thompson, man. He has been insane. He was at Stephen F. Austin, which is an FCS school, right? So a little bit smaller school. I believe he's listed at 6'6" and 238. I got to double check on the height, but I'm pretty sure it's like 6'6", 238. Like this dude is a long, athletic, 6'5", just under a hair under 6'6" and 238. He's got long vines for arms, and big hands. Like he was the guy that you look at and you're like, oh, this guy can play. And then he put on a show all week, especially in the one-on-one drills, because he's so explosive and athletic. He's a guy that's supposed to be on Bruce Feldman, or he was on Bruce Feldman's freak list. And man, he's going to test well and blow up the combine. And Justin and I talked about him. I think he's a guy that ends up going on day 2. Like, unless the weight is that big of a concern, you're talking about a guy that is size, speed, freak of nature. Yeah, he's supposed to be a guy that broad jumped 11.3, which is really good.
Holy cow!
Sub 4.640 and a 40-inch vertical with a 4.2 short shuttle. So like, this is a guy that like moves like a wide receiver, like a defensive back, and he's 6'6", 230. He put up big numbers at Stephen F. Austin, which is important. You know, Jess and I talk about this when we do this, and Jess and I hammer this home. Like, if you're a freak, you better perform against lesser competition. It's why a guy, and Jess remembers him very well. Last year, we loved him, Zion Johnson. You know, to go from D2 to the ACC and then be like the best offensive lineman in the ACC, that shows that you can play no matter what. You know, BJ Thompson, that's what he was able to do this week on a smaller scale, because obviously not transferring. Jose Ramirez, ASU fans probably maybe remember when the great Eastern Michigan team came in and beat the Sun Devils this year. Obviously not ideal. Again, it's funny, you're doing a lot of yin and yang. Ramirez is listed sub 6'2", 250 pounds. He has long arms for the size, though, over 33-inch arms, which is really good. The biggest question about him is something, and you're going to hear this a lot over the next couple of weeks until the combine. And then I don't even know if he got invited to the combine, to be completely honest. I'd have to double check. But he is in like less than 20th percentile for height, less than 10th percentile for weight, and he's a guy that's supposed to be just a 4.8 guy. Which, and when I say just a 4.8 guy, like, trust me, that's super, super fast. Like, people don't understand how fast that is. Like, when you're undersized, you better be super athletic. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes and where he fits, because you look at him, he's like a 10-pound lighter Marcus Golden type of guy that does. And so, you know, not a bad prospect by any means, but you know, what would we think of drafting Marcus Golden again in the second round? I think a lot of people would be hit and miss with that. A guy that was touted as a first rounder after his freshman year and had such a bad follow-up that he actually transferred to Nebraska, and he put up okay numbers at Nebraska, and now he is he's at the Shrine Bowl. So again, when he was at TCU, and his name's Ochaun Mathis, maybe. Justin's not here to correct me, so I don't know. But he's a guy you want to talk about. 2.5 sacks as a freshman, 8 sacks as a sophomore. And so everybody's like, watch out for this dude. And think about this. Think about how dominant TCU's defense was this year and what they could have done if he was at his prime. He came back last year, only had 2 sacks, left, went to Nebraska, only put up 1.5 sacks. So like, he never really caught that again. He had a good week, he had a good game. He's a guy that's really intriguing because of what you saw early in his career and whether or not he can kind of recapture that. 6'4.5", 250. But again, these guys, they're just built so funny, dude. 6'4.5", but he's got 35-inch arms. Like, he is built like a small forward, at 6'5", 250, but with 35-inch arms, like Mikal Bridges type build out there in terms of just length, and so those guys, if they can be taught how to use that, man, they're tough to beat. And so he's a guy that is really intriguing. Another interesting guy that had a good week, Moro Jomo out of Texas. Um, he's a guy in that you would look at and kind of be a little underwhelmed, if you would. Like, it's a tough one, and because he's 6'2", 93, that's not exactly what you're looking for in terms of an interior guy, but he plays pretty athletic, and he is a guy that has made splash plays, especially this season. You saw 5.5 tackles lost, 3 sacks, playing at Texas, so he played against great competition. He came in 15 pounds or 12 pounds heavier than they listed him at. Of course, he came in an inch shorter. That's why I have trust issues. And these things, that matters. Like, you're talking about an interior disruptor type of guy that you need to get to know. And then, I'm always hesitant to list certain guys or certain positions, because it's like, are they going to draft them? Or would they, is he a guy that they would be interested in? But this guy's so good all week. He made the Shrine practice team, all practice team. And that's Trey Dean out of Florida. And Dean's a really interesting one, because you look at Florida, they haven't exactly been great, right? And they've underachieved, but he's a guy that makes big plays at big times. He's a guy, as a safety, he's a big safety. They list him at 6'2", 205. Like, that's a big guy. And last season he had a great year for a safety. This season it stepped back just a touch, put up about half the production he did last year. But man, he was all over the place, and really kind of made his presence known. He's an instinctive kind of enforcer back there. I just don't know if he fits in Arizona, where he probably is going to get drafted. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not sure if that's a guy that you want to put a high leverage pick on, unless you're looking at, and again, just throwing it out there, not saying we know anything, but like, unless you're looking at maybe moving on from Buda Baker to try to get some cap relief, right? And Buda is obviously a different size player, but like, they use Buda similar to what Trey, I think, could do in the NFL. I'm not going to say he'd ever get there, but could do in the NFL.
And any other defensive players of note that wrap that up?
Yeah, that's really it for the offense and defense in terms of risers, and we can talk about a couple guys that disappointed if you real quick.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so a couple names that just didn't play well that you were really hoping to see. Tommy DeVito was bad. Another quarterback. Again, this game was just bad, and so DeVito was a guy that I thought he could come out and play well. He just didn't. I just don't know if he's even draftable at this point, which is tough, man, because like we talked about, the quarterback position is so hard to find guys in the NFL. He looked really bad at this week. A guy that Arizona State fans know, and he's played. I feel like he was pretty good at ASU. You watch them a lot more closely than I do, so I'm interested to get your take on him. Kyle Soule did not look like he can play in the league, which was really interesting, because I thought the last 2 years he kind of showed that, but this week he seemed slow and and not as physical as I remember him. And you
Solely
mentioned
is real interesting to me because he's one of those guys I thought was like you'd have to wait and see with all-star thing combine, because he was an impact player here, but he wasn't dominant enough. It's not like even a guy like Evan Weaver, the Cardinals drafted, Defensive Player of the Year, Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year, was dominant. And he couldn't cut it in the NFL. And so for me, Soley wasn't even doing that. And so I always wondered if he was just a college production kid.
Yeah, and that was the thing, is like I thought the last 2 years, like I said, I thought he looked better. And this week he looked slower and less physical than I remember. And then, you kind of go back and think about this year with ASU, and that would make sense why they had so much trouble, right? Stopping the run up the middle is,
Yeah.
if your inside backer's slow and soft, it's going to be tough to be. And so he's a guy that's making, they have him listed as making 110 tackles this year. It feels like he's making a lot of those tackles 7-8 yards downfield while he's getting dragged a little bit. And so I think that came out this week, and that's tough. And I don't want to, and I hate doing this to guys, so I'm going to stop at 2. I just thought those 2 were the ones that really negatively caught my eye, if you will.
And with that, we will end this edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, special for Cardinals Talk. Well, we'll be back in just a couple days and to talk Senior Bowl. Seth will be here, and we will bring on, as we did the last couple years, Justin Higdon. So it'll be kind of like the original Draft Breakdown podcast plus me here on the Rise of C-Red podcast.
Jess does a much better job of hosting and keeping everybody on task.
And with that, so we'll be back in a couple of days. Thanks for listening as always. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. We'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise up C-Red.